I find that many people think Obama has done his best to keep us out of war. That is the prevalent view that you hear among a lot of people in Washington. And it's so strange because if you're at all aware of what these last years have been, there have certainly been two good things, foreign policy-wise. Anybody want to throw
Cuba.
out? Cuba, a good one, opening diplomatic relations.
Iran deal?
And Iran. Iran deal, I would not say sort of. I would say Iran deal is a major accomplishment given the incredible opposition to it. And when you have opposition from two super strong countries, Israel and Saudi Arabia, and then you have the Israeli lobby of AIPAC and others that were just created, these, what they call grass tops groups that all of a sudden exist with office and a name and letterhead and a lot of money, and they're just created to oppose the Iran nuclear deal. So there was lots of opposition to it. And the fact that we all rallied behind it and gave the president support, it was weird, let me tell you, working with the White House on something. But, yeah, for a change. And that one, I think, was very important. But on the other hand, we have all these examples of how the Obama administration carried on the same policies of the Bush administration and more. I find it interesting that Obama was against the war in Iraq, and Hillary Clinton even said she learned from that, right? That was a mistake. And yet, what did they do in Libya? I mean, the same, I don't know what they learned from, because here they went ahead and did the same thing of overthrowing a government, getting rid of a leader, and thinking that things were going to be okay, that there was not going to be like chaos left behind. And it just seems this total disregard for what happens to the local people when you do this kind of thing. So I look at Obama's years, and aside from a couple of good things, I see bombing 7 different countries. Anybody want to shout them out? Somalia. Yemen. Pakistan. Afghanistan. Iraq. Syria.
Ethiopia.
No, I don't think so. Those are our allies.
I think we did all 7 of them. No, did we say Libya? We'll do them again. No, we didn't say Libya. And all of them have something in common. Muslim countries, majority Muslim countries. But they hate us for our values.
Yeah, of course they do.
Yes. And the book I wrote before this book was around drone warfare, and just seeing the blowback from that as I travel around the region of people just saying, what do you think you are? Because you're the superpower, that means you can play God. That means you can have people comfortable, sitting in their chairs in the United States, air-conditioned room, ergonomic chairs, press a button, and kill people of color, because it's always people of color unless they make a mistake, and it's like 2 Americans that they've killed and an Italian. And not knowing who they are and playing the role of prosecutor, judge, jury, executioner, and you think there's not going to be blowback from that? Then I also find that people think that Obama has been tough on Israel. Do you find that? Yeah. But people think that, right? They think that he's been critical of Israel around settlements, that he doesn't like Netanyahu, and that's probably true. But he just negotiated the largest giveaway of our tax dollars. It wasn't enough that it was $3 billion a year. Now it's going to be $3.8 billion for the next 10 years. And that was just negotiated now under Obama. I also just returned from Europe, and it's quite interesting the perspective there, because they're looking with great dread at this heating up of a new Cold War. And they're seeing how during the campaign, Hillary Clinton talking about Putin and comparing him to Hitler. And they say, do the American people have any idea how insulting that is, knowing how many millions of Russians died during the Second World War? And they also say, do the American people know that there was agreement made with Gorbachev that NATO is not going to encroach further east on Russia's border. That was a deal. And that the US just went ahead and broke that deal. And all of NATO went ahead and broke that deal. And they also said, do you know, or do the American people know, that there are the largest war games, military maneuvers, going on Russia's border that have since the Cold War, with over 30,000 troops. So they say it's not an issue of whether you like Putin or not, or what you think about Russia's involvement around Syria. It's an issue that this is heating up in a very, very dangerous way, and especially with talk about a no-fly zone, and a no-fly zone. I was in the hearing when the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was grilled by members of Congress who wanted to hear them say, oh yeah, we could do a no-fly zone, no problem. And instead they said, oh, actually that would mean war with the Syrian government and with Russia. And the Republicans especially did not like that answer and kept grilling them and said, you don't really mean that, do you? And they do really mean that. And they also mean that it means troops on the ground. So there are many people, especially in other parts of the world, that are looking at where things are going and very, very concerned. They also have said to us, how can it be that you American people are so mean and nasty that you start these wars that result in these hundreds of thousands of refugees, and then you take 10,000 of them in your country? And meanwhile, the countries bordering them, like Jordan, like Turkey, like Lebanon, much poorer countries than we are, have taken millions of refugees. So, you know, there's for many reasons we don't have a very good reputation. But unfortunately, with our mainstream media and so much of this not coming up during the presidential campaign, not even with Bernie Sanders, who really, really stayed away from a lot of these issues. I mean, that was very wonderful that he mentioned the word Palestine. He actually said, Palestinians have human rights, or should have human rights, right? And that was considered really marvelous in this kind of climate. But, you know, when he was as a senator, he talked often about the military budget and the bloated Pentagon budget. And I thought it was really kind of strange to hear him being grilled about, well, Senator Sanders, how are you going to have all these young people have free college education, and how are we going to have this single-payer Medicare system? And he would say, well, you know, we tax the rich, and waste, fraud, and abuse, and get rid of the insurance companies. And really, the numbers don't add up unless you talk about the elephant in the room, and that's the Pentagon budget. And it's one thing he really did not want to address. So unfortunately, and another unfortunate thing, of course, is we don't hear the positions of people like Jill Stein of the Green Party because they don't get into the debates. So when it comes to foreign policy, you didn't hear a lot. And what you heard from Donald Trump was just strange stuff. You know, I was just talking about NATO, and at one point he said NATO's obsolete. And people in Europe were saying, wow, that's pretty cool, he's saying NATO obsolete. And then he turns around, well, I didn't really mean it was obsolete. I just mean that the countries in NATO are not paying their fair share, and we need a better deal, and I'm going to get a better deal, and they're going to pay for it. And so, you know, every time he would say something that was either actually a good thing or semi-good, he would usually go back and retract that. So we didn't get a lot of good, substantive reflection on our foreign policy during this time, which is very unfortunate, and leads us to this country that I want to talk about, which is one of the issues that Donald Trump actually brought up a couple of times when he said, Saudi Arabia is the country most responsible for spreading terrorism. But then, of course, Donald Trump has a lot of business deals with the Saudis, and they've bragged about how they bailed him out 3 times, twice buying buildings of his and once buying his yacht. They also, Donald Trump at one time during the debates, do you remember when he said, talked about Hillary Clinton receiving money from the Saudis for her foundation? And I thought it was actually pretty cool when he said, she should give back that money from the Saudis, but that sort of came and went very quickly. In general, I would say that, here I've been talking in a lot of different venues. I've been talking in mosques, I've been talking to student classes, I've been talking to other faith-based groups, and it's very interesting the perception that people have about Saudi Arabia. And what I found that is even among people who are progressive, who are part of the movement, when you say preaching to the choir, don't know very much about Saudi Arabia, that even our community has kind of stayed away until recently from dealing with Saudi Arabia out of a fear, I think. One is a lot is lack of knowledge. It's not like you can say, oh, I'm going to go do a research trip to Saudi Arabia and see what things are like. They're just not going to let you in. And the other is a fear of being caught up in Islamophobia. And so many of us are so concerned about what's happening to the attacks on the Muslim community that we don't want to play into that. And it's a delicate balance to be talking about the way the Saudis are spreading their version of Islam and to not fall into that Islamophobia. And I mentioned to you that I spend a lot of time in Congress, and it's very difficult to be talking to some people, especially the Republican Congress people, about this in a way that doesn't feed into that. So I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of us have avoided this issue until recently. And yet, my Muslim friends are really delighted that I'm going around talking about this and wrote the book about this. And they say, try not to speak about the Saudi version of Islam. Can you try to call it the Saudi perversion of Islam? And say that this is a kind of ideology that is not practiced by the vast majority of practicing Muslims, and that would have gone down in history as a cultish group that was easily overthrown by local people. And that goes back to the founding days. It's in the 1700s when this obscure cult-like Imam Muhammad Wahhab came up with his version of how the Quran should be interpreted in a very fundamentalist kind of way, and if you didn't interpret it in that way, you were an infidel, and it was okay to kill infidels. Well, this was very convenient for this very ambitious Saudi family that wanted to go around killing people to conquer their land and take over the Arabian Peninsula. And they said, great, we'll merge these two. In fact, they physically merged the two by having their kids marry each other. And then they went around fighting and conquering and taking over lands, ups and downs, until finally, into the 1930s, 1932, they declared the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And remember, when you say the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it's a family you're talking about, the Saudi family. And how kooky is it in this day and age to have a country named after a family where the founder then passed the rule on to his son that went to the next son, the next son, the next son, the next son. Finally, they're down to the last of the sons who can actually stand up. And they're going to have to figure out who they hand it to next. But this is the kingdom that would have been overthrown, like many such ones were overthrown, had it not been for the discovery of oil. And it was this discovery of oil in the 1930s by the Western concessions, what is now Chevron, that discovered this vast amount of oil beyond what they ever thought possible. And then it became, oh, now we're going to make sure that this kingdom stays in power so that our companies can continue to have the concessions and that we can continue to have access to this cheap oil. And so when I talk to my Saudi friends, they say, yeah, go around and say how awful our country is, because it is, and this government is really bad. But make sure you let people know it probably would not exist had it not been for the U.S. And there's a very famous meeting that happened in 1945 between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Saudi king during World War II meeting, and in so many words, FDR saying, we really don't care what you do internally in your own country. That's your own business. We will make sure you do not get overthrown, and we will have this oil for security pact. And that has gone on and on and on for 12 different administrations, with some ups and downs, but basically intact, between Republicans, Democrats, Republicans, and Democrats. And meantime, what has happened inside Saudi Arabia is that it is one of the most repressive governments in the world. It is a government that uses the death penalty for all kinds of nonviolent things. For example, let's see, do we have any atheists in the crowd? Atheists in the crowd. Problem. Do we have any people who identify with the homosexual community in the crowd? Problem. Do we have any sorcerers in the room? Come on, admit it. Beheadings are the way that most people are killed by the government in Saudi Arabia, oftentimes in public places. There's a square in the capital known as Chop Chop Square. When I was researching, I even found something they don't use very much, but they still do when find it necessary, and it's their own version of crucifixion, which is cutting off the head of the person, leaving it on the side, tying the person up in a public space, and leaving them there for several days as a warning for others. And the warning is, if you come out and try to organize against the kingdom, you will be considered a traitor. There is a constant drumbeat in Washington when there are these hearings that we can't defeat terrorism because Iran is the biggest problem. Iran is spreading terrorism. Iran is the most repressive country. They don't have free and fair elections. And you know what? Saudi Arabia does not have free and fair elections. You know why? They don't have elections. They don't even bother with the facade of having national elections for anything. There's no presidential elections, there's no assembly or congressional elections, and you never hear our leaders in Washington saying, admitting that there are no national elections in Saudi Arabia. There is no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of assembly, there's no freedom of association, no political parties, there's no labor unions. People who do blogs that talk about, wouldn't it be nice if we had a more liberal society, if there was more separation between religion and state, if we allowed more free thinking in Saudi Arabia. There's a young man named Raif Badawi who has 3 young children, started this blog. He was sentenced first to death. And then there was an outcry. He was commuted to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes. And his lawyer sentenced to 15 years in prison. So this is the kind of, the way that internal dissent is treated inside the kingdom. And then there are entire sectors of the population that are discriminated against. I really enjoyed writing this section in the book about women because I worked very closely with Saudi women on the chapter, going back and forth with them because I wanted to be fair. There are some gains that Saudi women have made, particularly around education. They fought to get education. First, the government said, all right, you want education, we'll give you education. The boys are in the Ministry of Education. They learn lots of different things. The girls are under the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and you will learn the Quran and how to be a good wife. And the women fought against that and wanted to have a broader-based education. They actually won a lot of gains. Right now, they're fighting for things like being able to have sports in the schools because the girls aren't allowed to have them. The schools are gender segregated. It is the most gender segregated society in the world. But women now have a chance to learn a lot of different things. And at the university level, there are more women than men at the college level. So they have made some gains, but still, it is what do you think of when you think of Saudi women? that they have to be totally covered when they're in public. It's not an optional thing, have to be totally covered, and that they can't drive. It is the only country in the world where women are not allowed to drive. And when you ask Saudis, well, why is that? You get all kinds of very weird answers. Well, our women are like princesses. We wouldn't want them to get hurt behind the wheel. Our women are too precious to be driving. They should be driven by somebody else. It would not be safe to have women on the road. There was an imam who issued a fatwa who said it would be their ovaries would be harmed if they were driving. Basically, it is a power trip, and women have been fighting for the right to drive for a long time. And the way they fight for the right to drive is civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is getting behind the wheel of a car and driving. And they've done that many different times, end up getting arrested, getting sentenced, losing their jobs, having their passports taken away. But the real problem for women, the biggest problem for them, is what's called the guardianship system. Anybody know what that is? Some of you? Yeah, what is it?
Well, you need the permission of either your father or your husband in order to travel or get out of their home or
to marry who you want to marry, to work where you want to work. From the day you're born, your entire life. You might be 98 years old. It might be your son who is your legal guardian and has to decide things. So this system where women are not whole citizens, whole individuals, it has to be a man who either approves or disapproves. And you might have an enlightened guardian that lets you do all kinds of things. And you might have a really backward guardian and your life is hell. I don't know if any of you saw the New York Times had some interesting things recently around asking women from Saudi Arabia to write in about the guardianship system. And it was quite interesting. You know, some women say, I have no problem. My guardian lets me do what I want. And others say, it's like living in a cell. My life is a living hell. And there are thousands of women who recently signed a petition calling for a lifting of the guardianship system. So, you know, they are fighting, but it's like, you know, what century are we in? How backward is it that they still have to be fighting these fights? Then I was naive when I was doing research for the book because I thought that as a religious a society based on a theocracy, it is a theocracy, that they would have respect for people's right to religion. And that is not the case. If you are not practicing Islam the way the Wahhabi, the conservative clerics want you to practice Islam, and you know they have religious police who force businesses to close down when it's prayer time, who yell at the women if they are not totally covered. And if you are not practicing the way they would like you to, you are discriminated against. If you are a Sufi that uses music and dance, that is discriminated against in public places. If you are of the minority Shia, because Saudi Arabia is a majority Sunni country, and you know the majority of the Shia live in the eastern part of the country, which is the oil-rich part of the country. You would think they would be the richest people in Saudi Arabia, not so. And it is the only country in the world where it is illegal to have a non-Muslim place of worship. Well, you might think that's big deal. Everybody is Muslim, except that there are millions of people in Saudi Arabia who are not Muslims. And anybody want to guess why that is?
Guest workers.
Guest workers. Smart crowd here. Guest workers. So enormous number of guest workers. There are 30 million people in Saudi Arabia. About 10 million of them are guest workers. And some of them are Westerners or engineers that are working for the Saudi oil company, Aramco. They live in their own compounds. They get paid well. But the vast majority of them are coming from very poor countries like India, Bangladesh, the Philippines. And the problem there is similar to the women's issue where they need a guardian. The foreign workers, guest workers, need a sponsor. You can't just say, I'm going to go to Saudi Arabia and see what I can find and try to get a job and send money home to my family. No, you need a sponsor. And you go to a recruiting place, you usually already have a debt because you had to pay a recruitment fee. You get there, you are promised one thing, and by the way, a lot of these jobs are ones that the Saudis decided as they started getting wealthier that they didn't want to do this work themselves. So this is working out in the 110-degree heat in construction. This is working as domestic workers in homes, and even middle-class Saudis will have oftentimes a driver for the women, somebody taking care of the children, somebody cleaning the house, and certainly there are employers who are good, decent, nice people and good to their employees, and then there are those who are really awful and working them 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, not paying what they said they would pay, not even feeding them well, physical abuse, sometimes sexual abuse, and I tell some horrible stories in that chapter. And okay, so you say, this is awful, I'm getting out of here. No, you're not getting out of there because you can't leave unless you have an exit visa and your sponsor has to sign the exit visa. And so you are trapped. It's a modern day form of slavery, and by the way, slavery was not abolished until 1962 in Saudi Arabia. So there's that entire sector of the population suffering. When you look at, it's bad enough that there's this internal repression, but then we see that the Saudis are spreading this perversion of Islam to other places. And that is really quite a new phenomenon, and it came on the heels of the Iranian Revolution when Iran had overthrew the Shah. It became its own theocracy, but a Shia one, and said, you know, we are the guardians of Islam. And the Saudis says, no, we are, and we're going to spread ours quickly, and they started building mosques and schools and training the local preachers and imams, paying their salaries in other countries, spreading this throughout the Middle East. I was just with a friend who was living in the West Bank in Palestine. And she said, I was sitting down in a cafe and a man came over to me and said, look at the mosque over there. Saudi mosque. Look at the mosque over there. Built by the Saudis. Look at the one over there, built by the Saudis. He said, why the hell are the Saudis building so many mosques when what we need are things that are going to help feed people, are going to help develop our country? We don't need any more mosques. And even Obama talked about how he lived in Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country in the world, very moderate form of Islam that's practiced, and how you could see the creeping extremism as the Saudis started coming in and building their schools and their mosques. And we don't have to speculate about what our government knew, because now we can see the cables that have been coming out that show that they knew all too well that not only were the Saudis spreading the ideology, but they were also funding the extremist groups. And, you know, it's Al-Qaeda. A cable shows from 2014, the U.S. knows that Saudi Arabia is funding ISIS, that they are even funding groups in Africa, and that oftentimes the cables would sound like they're pulling their hair out. What are we going to do about these Saudis? We can't stop them from supporting these extremist groups. Well, there were a lot of things that the U.S. could do, like put sanctions on Saudi Arabia, but not at all. In fact, I discovered in the research that there is a law in the U.S. books that says that is called the Freedom of Religion Act. If you are not, every year we will study which countries are the worst in terms of religious intolerance, and we will sanction those countries. And they're in a category called countries of concern. And every year, North Korea's on that list, sanctioned. Every year, Burma's on that list, sanctioned. Every year, Saudi Arabia's on that list. State Department gave them an indefinite waiver, so they would never have to be sanctioned for it. So the hypocrisy goes on and on and on. And, you know, of course, we have the situation in the U.S. with 15 of the 19 hijackers being from Saudi Arabia. I didn't want the U.S. to invade any country after 9/11, but if there were one, it would be a little more rational to have invaded Saudi Arabia and not Afghanistan or certainly not Iraq. And we can talk in the discussion about the 9/11 families and this lawsuit if you want to sue Saudi Arabia in US courts. But so at some point, we need the American people to sit back and say, we have been fighting this war against terror for at least 15 years. We have been using trillions and trillions of dollars that could have been used for more important things back home. Our soldiers keep getting killed even now in this fight against extremism. We have killed many, many, many people overseas in this fight against extremism. And two things have happened. One, the extremism has only spread. And two, why is it that we are in bed with the country that's most responsible for spreading this extremism? And some people might cynically say oil. Well, you know, one, obviously, we need to get off of our fossil fuel addiction. And we are not as dependent on Saudi oil as we used to be, unfortunately, because of things like fracking in this country. But we only get 13% of the US imports, foreign imports are coming from Saudi Arabia. Still, it's important. Still, Western companies want to be able to work there, want the cheap Saudi oil, want to control the region. But there are other things now that have tied us to the Saudis. And lo and behold, unbeknownst to most Americans, the Saudis have become the #1 by far weapons purchaser from the United States. And not just from the United States, from Canada, Germany, from the UK, from Sweden, from all of these countries. They have just been buying and buying and buying weapons. And I want to acknowledge Robert Naiman in the back there for doing such an amazing job by trying to push our elected officials to do something about this. But until recently, they have just been saying nothing about 42 different weapons deals that happened under the Obama administration alone. You know, $115 billion worth of weapons is a hell of a lot of weapons. And for those of you who worked on the Israel issue, you might know that it was $3 billion of our tax dollars that were going to the Israeli military, well, going to US weapons companies that then go to the Israeli military. And that's a lot of money, and many of us have been complaining about that. You multiply that times 8 years of the Obama administration, $24 billion. Compare that to $115 billion worth of weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. It's way bigger. So where do these weapons end up? They end up in Syria, supporting the Al-Qaeda affiliate. They end up in Iraq. They end up in Libya. They end up repressing their own people inside Saudi Arabia. They end up crushing democratic uprisings like in Bahrain. They end up in this war in Yemen, which is a place where we finally have been able to get our congresspeople to start paying some attention to this, because they do have the power, if they want, to stop these weapons sales. And some of us have been working very hard to try to push our media to get out more information about what's happening in Yemen, because it is a place that where it was one of the poorest countries in the entire region to begin with, and now is an absolutely devastated country, where the Saudis, with the help of the US, have been hitting all kinds of civilian targets, from clinics and hospitals to factories, sewer systems, water systems, residential neighborhoods, markets, weddings, funerals. And this is not just US weapons, this is US maintenance of the weapons, US refueling of the planes in the air, US giving help in targeting, US logistical support, US diplomatic cover. And it is a disastrous situation in which millions of people have been displaced, millions of children now suffering from severe malnutrition, facing a famine, because the majority of the food is imported, and now it's very difficult to get the food in now. There is a cholera outbreak because of the lack of clean water and the lack of medical facilities. And just a few members of our Congress, like Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, have been saying, this is blood on our hands, and the Yemeni people see this as a U.S. war. So imagine the kind of animosity, the kind of blowback that will come for a long time to come because of this. So the issue around weapon sales, some of you have probably been doing this, but I do have some flyers there, maybe we could pass them out as a reminder for people to make the calls. And Robert, perhaps you want to tell us where the local Congress and Senator people stand on this issue?
So, the relatively good news, 27 members of the Senate voted against the last Saudi arms deal. And 2 of those senators were Dick Durbin and Mark Kirk. Amazingly. Mark Kirk was one of the 4 senators who voted no. I assume because he was running for re-election in Illinois. And we haven't yet had a clean vote in the House. The closest thing we've had to a vote in the House was the June 16th vote on the cluster bomb event. And Rodney Davis voted the wrong way.
For cluster bombs.
Yeah.
Cluster bombs. For anybody who doesn't know, this is a weapon that the international community has banned because they break up into bomblets. They're left on the ground and little kids pick them up and get blown up from it. And the U.S. has not signed on to the cluster bomb treaty, and there was a U.S. company continuing to produce cluster bombs, sell them to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen. And you know, I met with the Quaker group that had been protesting their facility for years. And when the Human Rights Watch did a report showing how cluster bombs were being used, they revved up their protests, and other groups in New England started protesting at their facilities, at their headquarters, and many of us pushing in Congress until we got very close on this vote, and then President Obama put a halt on the sale of cluster bombs. Best news is that the company Textron announced it would no longer be producing cluster bombs. So let's give a clap because we don't get a lot of victories in this.
They have a big stockpile, I heard, though,
Yeah.
right?
There's always another
One in the
side.
crowd, yeah.
So I would just say on this, I'm passing these out because there's going to be another round of weapon sales. These just keep happening. So just make the call and say no more weapons to Saudi Arabia. And the last things I want to say in terms of a kind of more holistic view of what the ties are between U.S. and Saudi Arabia are the Saudis and the Saudi government taking Saudi money and investing it heavily in the U.S., in U.S. Treasury bonds, hundreds of billions of dollars in Treasury bonds, in U.S., all kinds of U.S. companies. They've been buying up the biggest refinery in Texas. They bought 10,000 acres in Arizona and California to produce water-intensive crops that they can't produce back home because they live in a desert and because of their own addiction to oil, and then flying alfalfa, for example, back to Saudi Arabia. They have invested in companies like Uber, and $3.5 billion in Uber, so much money that they get a seat on the board. And I find this all quite ironic given that half the population in Saudi Arabia is not able to drive. And on top of that, they use checkbook diplomacy. So they give money out very astutely to Ivy League schools, to think tanks, also very funny because you couldn't have a think tank in Saudi Arabia. Liberal ones, conservative ones, they give money to foundations. So I already mentioned the Clinton Foundation, but other foundations, Jimmy Carter's foundation has gotten money from the Saudis. And I was at this hearing once where John McCain was testifying, and I had a lot of things to do that day. I was determined not to say anything and not to get arrested, to hold my tongue. And yet he was going on and on and on about Iran. And I just couldn't stand it because, at one point I had to just jump up and say, how come you never say anything about Saudi Arabia and the spread of terrorism? And of course, he called the police. And as we were waiting for them to come, I quickly Googled John McCain and Saudi Arabia and found that he had taken $1 million for his foundation from the Saudis. And then the last thing is that there are all these lobbyists that are now paid foreign agents for the Saudi government. You know, if you work for a foreign country, you have to register it as a foreign agent. You would think that anybody who had any standing in Washington, D.C. would be really embarrassed to be representing the Saudi government. But no, I mean, these are former senators. These are former people high up in the military. There is one of the agents is the Podesta Group. Anybody heard of the Podesta Group? So you might know it was started by two brothers. One of them, John Podesta, who was Bill Clinton's chief of staff and is now the chairperson of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Well, John and Tony thought, we got a lot of good contacts in Washington. We ought to parlay this into money. Let's form a lobby group, which they did. When John Podesta left to run Hillary Clinton's campaign, Tony Podesta added to his group of lobbyists the Saudi government and is receiving $140,000 a month from the Saudis. So all of these intertwinings are things that we've got to kind of peel away the layers of and find ways to embarrass these people who are spokespeople for the Saudis, embarrass them for taking Saudi money, embarrass them for rubber stamping weapons deals to Saudi Arabia, and on the other hand, to be lifting up the voices of the real Saudi Democrats who want to change their country. Because, you know, the question is, how is this going to change? And when I ask Saudis, they almost always say to me, we are really afraid of this system falling apart and through some kind of violent upheaval, and what will come in the place is even worse. Chaos like you see in Syria or Libya or Iraq. A vacuum because we don't have a civil society that could come into the, fill that vacuum. It would be these armed groups like ISIS. So they say, you know, we have to step up the efforts to reform our system quickly so that it doesn't topple by violent means. And when I say, well, what kind of things? You know, this is what I have in the last chapter of the book, which is looking at, I gave example of the women who are trying to get rid of the guardianship system. There are very sophisticated lawyers and professors in Saudi Arabia, and they have been trying to negotiate with the government and say, look, we are now an absolute monarchy. There are monarchies all over the world that are not absolutist monarchies. They have the king and the queen, and they do all kinds of ceremonial things, and the people seem to like them. But those are constitutional monarchies. How about if we get a constitution in this country, and we move towards a constitutional monarchy? Or the Shia, who are saying, all we want is to be treated like equal citizens. The migrant workers, the foreign laborers, who are saying, we want the right to get rid of this exit visa issue and be able to be organizing when we are abused. So there are all kinds of people who are fighting for to change their system. There's one way for us to really be in touch with Saudis, and that is the internet. And it's quite remarkable, while the government would like to crack down on the internet, it's so vast, and the Saudis are such major users of social media that they can't crack down on it. And we found, for example, that we got in touch with a family in Saudi Arabia whose son had been arrested for nonviolent protest. He was part of the Shia community, and he was sentenced to death. He's on death row right now, 17 years old when he was arrested. His two friends arrested with him were both 15 years old. And they said to us, can you help publicize his case? And they gave us footage of him in the house, playing with his sister, helping out, just, you know, a lovely young man. And we did a very short video clip, 2 minutes long, and we put it up saying, call the Saudi embassy, call the US State Department, ask for him to be freed. We thought maybe a couple thousand people would watch that video. A couple of weeks later, there were 4 million people who had seen the video. And when we looked at the back end, most of them from Saudi Arabia.
That's great.
Yeah, and the parents saying to us the only reason he's still alive is because people are helping to give a higher profile to his case. So these are the kinds of things that we can do, not only to save individual lives, but to show there are Saudis who have really good ideas about their country, how their country should change. And those, if we are really a democratic society that wants to promote democracy abroad, those are the people that we should be helping. And I think as individuals, we can be at least doing those two things, stopping the weapons sales and promoting the voices and the causes of the real democratic Saudis. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much. And let's open it up for discussion.
Can you say a little more about the Shia powder keg, it's called sometimes, because they happen to live on where most of the oil is and all that?
Yeah, so the Shia are the majority. They do live where most of the oil is. They have risen up periodically, last time being during the Arab Spring. And during the Arab Spring, the Saudis were just really, the regime was really worried that people were going to rise up, which is one of the reasons they destroyed the neighboring uprisings like in Bahrain. And they also used the carrot and stick, and part of the carrot is the majority of Saudi citizens work for the government. And because the government has so much money, is quite well-paid salaries and not a lot of work. And when the Arab Spring happened, the Saudi government said, uh-oh, we better make sure we do a little, passing out of some goodies. And what they did was to provide 2 months free salary, extra bonus salary to every single Saudi worker who worked for the government. In the meantime, the Shia did make attempts at uprisings during the Arab Spring, and the Saudis crushed them immediately and didn't allow foreign journalists to come in and cover this, didn't allow, even crack down on people who were putting up videos about this, and arrested and sentenced to death the very beloved Shia sheikh, Nimr al-Nimr, who was supporting the young people who were going out on the streets. And the Shia community was very, very upset about that. And then in the beginning of this year, he was among a group of Saudis who were executed. And that created tremendous resentment inside the Shia community in Saudi Arabia. It created a terrible incident with Iran, majority Shia country, where the Iranian government basically let the angry Shia burn the Saudi embassy, and relations between the two were cut. This year, the Shia in Iran were not allowed to go to the Hajj, which is very problematic for them. Anyway, it is a powder keg, and particularly in the eastern part of the country, but in general, things are changing, because while I told you they could give out benefits to calm people down, that was when oil was way over, like $100 a barrel, and now it's down to $40-something a barrel, and the Saudi government is running at a big deficit, about $100 billion. They do have quite large reserves, but they're eating at them very quickly, and so the government is cutting down on some of the salaries, and a lot of the subsidized goods are being cut as well. And so there is a lot more anger among Saudis, there is growing unemployment, and the government is trying to find ways to entice, both carrot and stick, more private employers to hire Saudis instead of hiring foreigners, to try to reduce the problem of unemployment. But there is a great deal of unrest now about economic issues.
I'm just curious, it seems like you probably have a lot of enemies in Washington, and I'm just wondering, there was that article recently in the New York Times about Bill McKibben being just trailed by videographers all the time and trolled all the time. Have you faced any of that? Have you?
I faced it from the trolls that are part of the pro-right-wing Israeli community. And I faced it back in the earlier days around Iraq, where they used to protest outside our house, which I thought was pretty funny. You know, we would go out there and say, come on in, let's have a beer together, let's sit and talk about, no, you'd poison that, we would never. And certainly online, I mean, constantly you get people saying ridiculous things about you, but
I've read that videos that exist of the beheadings of, in Saudi Arabia, but they're taken covertly and they won't be shown here because of pressure from Saudi Arabia. Is that true?
well, it used to be that the Saudis were proud and would let that go out, but then it became clear to them that people in the world didn't really like this, and especially now with ISIS and showing, you know, the Saudis were very embarrassed when it turned out that in ISIS-run territories they were using Saudi textbooks in the schools. And the Saudis really didn't want people to see what they were doing. In fact, when they took out this young man, Raif Badawi, the blogger, for flogging, he was sentenced to 1,000 lashes. And think of this. They were supposed to be administered in groups of 50, and it would be every Friday after prayers. So they did the first one, and somebody videoed it. And it wasn't a very good video, but it still went viral. And people, again, were outraged by that. And it shows the Saudis, you know, can feel some pressure, because after that, the next week came and they said he didn't get flogged because he didn't heal enough from the last flogging to flog him again. And then the next week came and they said he still wasn't healed. And then it turned out they didn't administer any more of them. Of course, he's still in prison, but they were too embarrassed to do that again.
Does it make sense to you why the Saudis, as they are, would be so threatened by having a Shia government in a small, poor country in Yemen that they would destroy the country in order to stop them? Why is it so important to them?
They are obsessed with Yemen and the spread of what they see as Shia influence in the region. You know, it is quite ironic that when the U.S. invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein, who came in? Shia government. And who has influence now in Iraq? Shia. And so they're seeing the spread. They're seeing Shia influence in Lebanon. They're seeing Shia influence in the region that is spreading, and they are terrified about it. And so when this group, the Houthis, rose up in Yemen, the Houthis practice a religion that is close to the Shia, and the Saudis got very worried that Iran would take advantage of that, and they would have an Iranian allied government at their next door. And so they went in and perhaps in the same vein as George Bush thought, oh, this will be quick and dirty. We'll just go in there and, you know, get rid of these. And now it's been 19 months. And when I corner people in the Senate or in the House about why are we helping the Saudis committing war crimes in Yemen, I had the head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, Bob Corker, say to me, this is a deal we made around the Iran deal, that the Israelis would get more money and the Saudis would get helping Yemen.
If I could, the Saudis were involved in the forced merger of the Oman and Yemen when they were separate. And so there's actually a political dimension too. There was a left-wing government in one of the two polities, and the Saudis were involved in making that one state of Yemen, and it obviously wiped out the left-wing fraction of the government. So
Yeah,
I don't
the
think it's
South
all
was socialist, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed, that too collapsed. So yes, the Saudis have been involved. Yeah.
How do you, what suggestions do you have about this massive ignorance, constructive ignorance that we in the United States have about foreign affairs? I mean, there's no question that it's contributing to the national elections. I don't like to use the word identity politics, but I find like people can see more visibly oppression if you're gay or if you're Muslim and stuff like that. But I know that people have no, myself included, have no idea of where these countries are. They're all massed in some clump of, don't go there. You know, if you ask an American to make a map of the world, it's like, don't go there, it's dangerous, don't go there, don't
That's
go
all
there.
we gotta say to the our military, don't
Don't
go
go
there.
there. So I know you've written the book in order to address this question.
Sorry.
But do you have more ideas about how to make it attractive and interesting that people would know what's happening when we don't have journalism anymore that is covering it?
It's hard.
Well, there are lots of alternative sources of media, and as I go and talk to students, I, put Democracy Now! Down, and I give out things with, sorry.
You better answer it.
Cocktail lounge.
Give them all kinds of alternative sources of media that they can get. I talk to them about, how ironic that's, for us, the best sources of media about our government, particularly world affairs, is the media from other countries. And how many of you look at foreign sources of media? Where do you look? Where do you go?
Deutsche Welle.
RT, BBC,
Deutsche Welle.
Guardian, what?
Telesur?
Telesur, yeah. It is very sad commentary on the state of our media. So one is to give people other ideas of other sources of media. The other is to do a much better job than we have been doing relating it to the corruption of our system, which people understand. And right now, whether people who are going for Bernie Sanders or whether they're going for Donald Trump, it's a shared disgust with the system. And I am just like super excited about all these young people who now have a more favorable view of socialism and capitalism. I mean, I think that's just extraordinary and something, of course, they don't really know what socialism means, but who does, So I think this is really great and something to build on. And there are groups that have been building up an awareness among young people about the corruption of our political system in general. And I've been invited many times to talk to them about how the weapons system fits into that, and how the weapons industry makes pieces of their damn weapons in every single congressional district, and then gives money to the Congress people, and then the Congress people come back and said, we couldn't possibly cut that weapon even if the Pentagon wants to cut it because they don't need it, because it's jobs in my community. So, showing how this is part of the corruption of our system. Talk to groups like students that are worried and trying to do something around the student debt issue to say, one weapon system, the F-35, could fund free college education for every young person in this country for the next 23 years, according to the National Priorities Project. The Black Lives Matter movement has taken these issues as a part of theirs. The way they have embraced the Palestine issue, going to Palestine, coming back, showing that this is really similar kinds of oppressions, and even in their platform for Black Lives, daring to use the word apartheid and genocide, which really pissed off a lot of conservative Jews in this country. And even taking on the military-industrial complex and saying that this has to be addressed if we're ever going to have the funds we need for the programs that can provide jobs and stop the mass incarceration and all these kinds of things. So there are a lot of openings, and a big opening that we have to really work on is with the environmental community. And I know there's some of you here that have been working on the coal issue, on the fracking issue, and there are so many links that we can and have to make more visible about these issues. And I'm looking forward in the coming year to working with people to find out ways and get people together both at the national level and at the local level to come together and look at how the environment and war are related in myriad ways, and how we can talk about them together more. and take a page from the environmental community that's done such a good job on this issue of divestment from the fossil fuel industry, which gives people something to do at their university level, at their union, at their in their pension fund, all of these institutional religious investors. And we haven't done that in the weapons industry. And that's crazy. So, you know, pairing up with them now and saying, can we tag on with you as you say no fossil fuels? Can you include in there no weapons? And I've been trying to speak at Catholic universities and Catholic institutions because I love the quote that the Pope did when he came here last year and he spoke to Congress. And he said, why are we giving weapons to these people who are using them in such abusive ways? And the answer we all know is money, money that is soaked in blood. And we are complicit if we don't speak out. We have to do something and stand up to the arms industry. And it was really funny because you saw these people in Congress who were cheering like, yay! But, you know, we need to use that quote and go to these Catholic institutions and make that one of the wedge groups that starts, you know, divesting and providing an example for others. So I think there's, you know, a lot of things we can do.
I don't know how much time is left, but one question is more, you know, like curiosity based. You would think that when Bush and Cheney and the others were planning to attack Iraq, they would have some conversation with the Saudis. I mean, because they were just so close. And you would expect the Saudis to tell them, don't do this.
They did.
Because Iran gonna get strong.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so they did?
They did, exactly. And the Saudis were against, the Saudi government was against the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Okay, but it had no effect then.
It had no effect, and just the opposite, the Saudis ended up helping.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of saying to the U.S., you know, we told you this would happen, and it wasn't a good idea, but there were many other forces that were pushing for the invasion.
Right.
It is 5:25, and we do have to be out of here by 6. So maybe take one more question,
Yeah.
and then if anybody wants to buy a book, Medea will sign them.
You invited one about the 9/11 suits, so
Well, let's see if who would like to.
please tag that on too.
Two questions.
What, is there anything else that anybody, and it doesn't have to be a question, it can be a suggestion, criticism, anything. Did you have some?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. We're seeing like Russia ramping up their military presence in Eastern Europe and like sending a ship through the English Channel now to go towards the Mideast possibly. Is there like maybe a similar fear of Russia with Saudi Arabia as there is in the U.S.? That's been sort of the narrative that Russia is this evil empire that's going to take, you know. How do Muslims view in Saudi Arabia? How do they view Russia? And the paranoia, is it similar, you think?
The paranoia is Iran and the fact that the Iranians and the Russians work together. And this is what really is worrisome to, I mean, not the ordinary Saudi person, but to the government, certainly. And you see in Syria, they are on different sides. So there is a lot of, I mean, the feeling is that the proxy wars that are going on in the Middle East are the Russians and the Iranians versus the Saudis and the U.S. I mean, that's to break it down very simplistically, but yes.
We know that, you know, the U.S. has been selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, and is it sort of a pretext for defending themselves against a Russian invasion, is what I'm getting at, or a U.S., you know?
No, they are not worried about a Russian invasion. No,
Yeah,
I mean,
well-
it really, I don't think that, the Saudis are worried more about groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS that are now internally blowing up things inside Saudi Arabia. And this is like the Frankenstein child coming back to haunt them, but not really about the Saudis. They worry about the Saudis and the supporting the Iranians and how that strengthens Iran. And about the 9/11 issue, it's some of you might remember that in September, Congress did a kind of miraculous thing, I think, and 9/11 families have been pushing for 15 years for the right to sue the Saudi government in US courts. And governments that are not considered state sponsors of terrorism are supposed to have immunity, so that immunity was lifted. And President Obama vetoed it because he said he wouldn't want this precedent of other countries being able to sue us in their courts. And I think, gosh, wouldn't it be great if when we commit war crimes, people could take us to court? Maybe it would curb our committing of those war crimes and also give them an option, because I've met a lot of people who thought their only option was to join a group like Al-Qaeda because they didn't have a way to take the US to court. So the issue now is that Congress, it looks like a lot of people are now having second thoughts. And Bob, you might want to second me or add to this discussion, but it does seem like the Saudis are going in double and triple time trying to get this thing at least amended more. And it was amended many times, so it is, oh, come on, I keep turning this off, sorry. So I think the issue of already they have hired now, in addition to these 8 lobby groups that I mentioned, I was asking the question, it's now 10 lobby groups, and 2 more of these lobby groups are focusing on the statewide level, trying to get governors to say, we need the Saudi commerce, and this is important for our economy, and if this thing goes through, the Saudis could pull out their money, and it would be very bad for us. And so I'm very worried that there's going to be a retake on this vote. In the meantime, if the lawsuits go through, what many of the 9/11 families really wanted was not financial compensation. What they wanted was information. And they think our government has lots and lots of information that they haven't provided yet. But of course, the government always has ways of not providing that information, even in a lawsuit. So if these lawsuits go forward, it's not clear that the US government is going to allow the most, juicy parts of the information that could even implicate some high up levels of people in the Saudi government. It could implicate people in the US who are covering up, who knows? But we don't know that these lawsuits are actually going to be allowed to take place. Robert, you want to?
I think it's unknowable at this point. There's like irresistible force meets a movable object. You're right that the Saudis are spending a tremendous amount of money. On the other hand, they spent a tremendous amount of money before the congressional override and got their clock clean. 98 senators voted to override the veto. And clearly there's a bunch of people in Congress who are saying, oh my gosh, we had no idea that this bill might have these other consequences, let's consider it. And that's obviously a lie. All these arguments were fully aired before the vote. So clearly they're trying to appease the Saudis by saying, oh yes, we hear your complaint, we feel your pain, we're very concerned about this. Whether that can actually be translated into substantially revisiting the bill, I think is unknown, maybe unknowable at this point.
And let's remember, though, that this bill was passed close to the anniversary of 9/11. It was the 15th anniversary, and it was an election season. And now, with elections being over,
Well, it was a bipartisan bill whose lead sponsor was Chuck Schumer, who's the senior senator from New York, and is the incoming leader of the Senate Democrat. This is not somebody that they can roll over easily. Also, the main thing that they floated as the fix that they want is, okay, let's just limit this to 9/11 and not going forward. So first of all, how this deals with the Saudis being insulted about being tied to 9/11, totally not obvious. Secondly, that idea was already floated and pushed for, and both Schumer and the 9/11 families rejected it. Because they said, no, this isn't just about 9/11. This is about changing the world for the future. So how they the main idea they have for reforming the bill has already been rejected. The other thing I think that is strange to watch about this is the Saudi argument. It's very hard to distinguish between the Saudi arguments against the bill and the CIA arguments against the bill. It's like the CIA is a mouthpiece for the Saudis, and the Saudis are a mouthpiece for the CIA. The Saudis talk about danger of sovereign immunity being eroded, U.S. soldiers. Wait, who's talking here? And in fact, the CIA and the Saudis are like two butts in one underwear. The New York Times has reported how the Saudi budget is basically a slush fund for the CIA. So I think when the Saudi government complains, it's like the CIA is complaining.
Yes. So it's to be determined, but we will probably have to have another round of putting pressure on our congresspeople to let the 9/11 families have their day in court. But in general, thank you so much for coming. Your